Today we are going to explore one of the most fascinating and forgotten secrets of medieval construction. The reason why wooden beams erected 700, 800, and even 900 years ago still remain standing, while the wood we use in modern constructions can barely survive a few decades. In this documentary, we will dive into the archaeology, the science, and the lost wisdom of the builders of the Middle Ages to understand how they mastered the art of making wood almost immortal. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There is a moment that repeats itself almost identically in the experience of anyone who enters a large medieval hall or an ancient church in Europe for the first time. The eyes naturally rise toward the ceiling, and there, suspended in silence, are the beams. Darkened by centuries of smoke, marked by time, slightly bowed under the weight of countless winters, these pieces of wood support structures that should, by the logic of the modern world, have collapsed long ago. There is something unsettling about this permanence, a beam carved by medieval hands, installed even before many current nations existed as such, remains there firm while the timber of houses built less than 40 years ago already shows signs of fatigue, rot, and structural collapse. It is a contradiction that disturbs, and it is exactly this contradiction that this documentary intends to investigate. What did medieval builders know that we have forgotten? What technique, what method, what philosophy of work allowed their works to cross the centuries with such resilience? The answer, like any good investigation, does not emerge immediately. It must be built piece by piece, like the cathedrals themselves. To begin unraveling this enigma, it is first necessary to confront a misconception that dominates modern carpentry. Ask any builder why wood rots, and the answer will be almost unanimous: moisture. Water is the enemy. This explanation, while not false, is dangerously incomplete. Moisture by itself does not destroy wood. The true destructive agent is biological. It is fungi. And fungi do not feed on water. They feed on sugars. Inside every freshly cut board, there is a reservoir of nutrients: glucose, sucrose, hemicellulose, simple carbohydrates, all present in the sap. For a fungus, a fresh beam is not a structural element, it is a banquet. Moisture acts only as an activating condition. Without food, without these internal sugars, fungi cannot develop, even in conditions of extreme humidity. Researchers at the University of Copenhagen identified what they called the fungal colonization threshold, demonstrating that the determining factor for decomposition is not the presence of moisture, but the availability of nutrients. Moisture is a condition. Food is the cause, and it is exactly at this point that modern wood fails. The industrial process of kiln drying removes water from the wood in hours or days, but it does not remove the sugars. All the glucose, all the hemicellulose, all the carbohydrates that feed the fungi remain intact. Chemical coatings are applied to the surface, creating an external barrier, but inside, the wood remains what decomposition organisms most desire: food. Medieval builders, without knowing biochemistry, understood this dynamics in a practical and intuitive way. They were not trying to protect the wood from water. They were trying to eliminate what fed the destruction. And this change in perspective changes absolutely everything. The clue to this understanding did not come from books. Medieval construction manuals, when they exist, rarely describe their wood preparation techniques in explicit detail. The answer came from archaeology. When researchers analyzed oak beams recovered from the old London Bridge, they found something they did not expect. In the deep interior of the wood, far beyond the reach of rainwater or the soil, residues of calcium and sodium were present, not on the surface, not in the outer layers, but embedded in the fibers themselves, in the heart of the beams. In the city of York, in England, similar analyses revealed traces of ash and ammonium sealed inside medieval roof beams, compounds that do not migrate naturally over time. Ash does not rise through wood by capillarity. Ammonium does not simply infiltrate through exposure to the environment. And then came the discovery from Stavanger, in Norway. Inside the beams of centuries-old barns, scientists found chloride crystals lodged deep in the grain of the wood, not near the surface, not in the outer millimeters, but in the absolute center of the pieces. 3 different regions of Europe, 3 distinct types of structures, 3 sets of minerals that, by natural logic, should not be there. The only possible conclusion was this: those woods had been deliberately submerged in solutions before being used in construction. Lime water, brine, ash mixtures, liquids rich in ammonia. These solutions penetrated deeply into the wood and transformed it at a fundamental level. It was not accidental contamination. It was intentional engineering. This discovery opened a door to an entirely new understanding. Medieval builders were not just drying the wood, they were bathing it. They were not sealing the surface, they were transforming the interior. And the technique they used silently solved the problem of fungal decomposition centuries before any human being understood what a fungus actually was. But the investigation did not stop there. The next question was even more surprising. This practice was not the guarded secret of an isolated village or the rare specialty of exceptional shipbuilders. The more archaeologists and historians deepened their research, the more evidence emerged that it was a continental system, a technology so widespread and normalized that medieval builders did not even feel the need to explain it in detail. The records of the English guilds offer the first documentary clue. In a carpentry regulation written nearly 700 years ago, a direct instruction appears. Boards must be washed in lye or lime water. Not a suggestion, a requirement. Lye and lime water, both strongly alkaline solutions, were to be used before the boards were installed in any structure. This was not decoration. It was not symbolic cleaning. It was applied engineering. In France, in monastic complexes where monks recorded everything with meticulous precision, similar instructions appear in the accounting records of works. Support posts, especially those that supported floors and galleries, were to be submerged for 8 days before installation. The language is clear and objective. It was not about spraying, it was not about rinsing, submerging, and even the robust farmers of Scandinavia, far from the academic centers of continental Europe, recorded the same idea. In their agricultural manuals, instructions from Norway and Western Sweden describe how builders should bathe logs in salt water before erecting the structure. They were not sailors treating ships. They were settlers and peasants preparing barn beams and house posts. Different languages, different climates, different cultures, and yet the same ritual appears everywhere. Soak the wood before building. Patterns like this do not arise by coincidence. They spread because they work, because the results are visible over generations. Medieval Europe silently shared a unified technique, refined over centuries and passed between builders not as secret knowledge, but as simple common sense. To understand why soaking the wood was so effective, one must enter the territory of materials science. The heart of the process is leaching, the slow and constant removal of sugars inside the wood, the same nutrients upon which fungi depend. When an oak or pine is cut, its fibers are saturated with sap containing hemicellulose and simple carbohydrates. Hemicellulose dissolves even in weak solutions, decomposing under prolonged contact with water or alkaline baths. Once dissolved, these sugars slowly migrate outward from the interior of the grain toward the surface. Researchers who studied the sugar content in green oak before and after immersion found that soaking for several days drastically reduced the nutrient load within the fibers. Soaking does not just wash the surface, it drains the interior by diffusion until the wood becomes biologically sterile. Fungi only colonize wood when nutrients remain above a certain threshold. If enough sugar is removed, the wood transforms into an environment where decomposition organisms cannot thrive. Ordinary wood is like a served dish. Leached wood is like an empty plate. No matter how much moisture touches it, there is simply nothing inside for the fungi to eat. But medieval builders were not content only with removing the fungi's food. Leaching eliminated the nutritional source, yes, but the solutions used in the bath themselves launched an attack on several biochemical fronts simultaneously. Each region used the materials it had at its disposal, and yet the effects were remarkably consistent. The solutions created an environment so hostile that microorganisms did not have the slightest chance of survival. Lime water, one of the most widespread solutions, caused a pH shock in the wood. When submerged in lime, the wood absorbs calcium compounds that subsequently react with natural tannins, especially abundant in oak, forming a substance called calcium tannate, a compound remarkably resistant to fungal enzymes. This is not folklore. It is chemistry executed centuries before its time. Salt water, used throughout the coastal regions from England to Norway, worked differently. The brine infiltrated the grain of the wood and destroyed fungal cells through osmotic collapse. Salt attracts moisture, pulling water out of microbial cells until they dehydrate and die. A beam dipped in brine transformed into a microscopic battlefield where mold simply could not establish itself. And then there was urine, used especially in monastic and rural environments. As it ages, urine produces ammonia, a natural compound capable of denaturing proteins and deactivating enzymes essential for fungal growth. For medieval builders, this was not waste. It was a potent biological weapon. And in agricultural regions, fermented plant solutions introduced acids and alcohols that broke down microbial structures, creating another layer of biochemical defense. Medieval artisans did not need to understand molecular diagrams to see the results. They simply observed which beams lasted longer and refined their methods over generations. Even Viking shipbuilders followed a similar logic. Analyses of the timbers from the Oseberg ship revealed chloride and acetate residues deep inside the pieces, evidence of immersion in brine and fermented mixtures to resist decades of exposure to oceanic moisture. Across Europe, different mixtures, different recipes, but always the same goal: to make the interior of the beam uninhabitable for any destructive form of life. There is still a piece of this puzzle that often goes unnoticed, but which played an essential role in the longevity of medieval constructions. Although the builders of the Middle Ages treated various types of wood, one species in particular seemed almost designed for this ancestral method: oak. What made oak so extraordinary was not just its strength or its density, but something hidden within its fibers: tannins. These natural, bitter, and chemically reactive compounds play a remarkable role when combined with lime water. When oak is submerged in a lime solution, the calcium binds to the tannins present inside the wood, forming a substance called calcium tannate. This compound acts as a kind of protective shield that the wood itself builds from its natural chemistry. A shield that resists fungal enzymes, slows the penetration of moisture, and reinforces the internal structure of the fibers. Medieval builders did not know the molecular details of this process, but they saw the results. With absolute clarity, oak treated with lime did not just survive, it endured. One of the most impressive examples of this durability rests under the roof of the Notre Dame de Paris Cathedral, whose wooden structure was so vast and so dense that it became known as La Forêt, the forest. Built almost entirely of oak in the 13th century, with about 5,000 trunks harvested from more than 500 hectares of ancient forests, this structure supported the cathedral's roof for more than 8 centuries, resisting storms, wars, and the relentless climatic variations of the Parisian region. Similarly, the wooden churches of Norway, the so-called stavkirker, erected between the 11th and 13th centuries, remain standing to this day. Of the nearly 2,000 estimated to have existed, only 28 survive, most in western Norway. But their permanence is a silent testimony to the effectiveness of these preparation techniques. The Borgund Church, built around the year 1200, and the Ernest Church, dating from approximately 1130, are living examples of wood that has crossed nearly a millennium. Scandinavian builders coated their churches with pine tar, a complex process that took days to prepare in peat and wood kilns, creating an additional layer of protection that complemented the internal treatment of the wood. Europe did not simply inherit resistant wood, it manufactured it. Even after immersion, however, there was a final step that mattered more than any modern builder could imagine: the drying phase. Not the fast-forced drying of the industrial kilns used today, but the slow, patient, and deliberate drying that often extended for months. Modern science has proven what medieval builders already understood from experience. Slow drying reduces the internal stress of the wood in significant proportions when wood dries too fast, as happens in industrial kilns. The outer layers contract before the inner ones can adjust. This creates tension, micro cracks and fissures invisible to the naked eye, but which for decomposition organisms act as open doors. These tiny fracture channels are exactly the paths through which fungi invade the interior of the wood. Medieval builders avoided this entirely. After immersion, they stacked the beams in shaded and ventilated yards, often elevating them on stone supports to keep them away from the damp ground. The wood was arranged so that air could circulate between each piece, allowing moisture to be released gradually, without deformation. Monastic orders, particularly the Cistercians, perfected these drying stacks. They organized the boards in alternating directions, separated by thin wooden spaces, forming orderly geometric towers that controlled airflow with precision. The goal was simple: to dry the wood slowly and uniformly, without haste. For medieval artisans, time was not an obstacle, it was part of the material. And by granting the wood the months it needed to stabilize, they consolidated the benefits of immersion, preserved structural integrity, and created beams capable of supporting the weight of centuries. There is one last secret that explains why medieval wood survived in environments where modern wood quickly succumbs. Once submerged and slowly cured, the medieval beam acquired hygroscopic inertia, the ability to resist sudden changes in its internal moisture. Fungi thrive when the moisture level inside the wood oscillates frequently. Modern houses with sealed walls and climate control systems create exactly these oscillations. But medieval wood behaved differently. Immersion had removed the sugars, minerals had altered the internal chemistry, slow drying had stabilized the grain. The result was wood that absorbed and released water gradually, according to the rhythm of the seasons. A large medieval hall experienced enormous environmental variations, and its beams barely reacted. In scientific terms, one environment creates turbulence inside the wood, the other creates stability. By controlling the microclimate within the wood itself, the builders made decomposition biologically impossible. And then came industrialization, and with it, everything that made medieval wood last began to disappear. Not because the old methods had failed, but because they simply did not fit into a world that began to worship speed. When steam-powered sawmills, railroad distribution of timber and factory schedules took control in Europe and America, the idea of soaking wood for days or drying it for months became unthinkable. Time, which had been an ally for centuries, suddenly became the enemy. Kiln drying replaced slow natural curing, chemical preservatives replaced mineral immersion, and builders began to treat wood the same way we treat most contemporary problems, by coating the exterior and hoping the interior resolves itself. But that was exactly the breaking point. The timber industry began to focus on appearance and surface protection, while medieval builders had focused on internal transformation. A kiln can dry a beam in hours, but it cannot remove the sugars from inside it. A chemical spray can waterproof the surface, but it cannot alter the biological environment. At the core of the wood, no matter how many layers of copper-based treatment or resin sealant are applied, the interior remains exactly what fungi most desire: food. Chemical treatment coats the wood. Medieval treatment transformed it. In the race for efficiency, we traded longevity for convenience. We embraced processes that saved days but cost centuries of durability, and without realizing it, we abandoned a method that once made wood almost immortal. The evidence of medieval superiority does not end in dusty archives or ruined monasteries. Modern restoration projects have provided some of the most revealing comparisons. In Germany, during the restoration of a medieval house built around the year 1320, workers removed a damaged beam and replaced it with new wood, treated with modern chemicals. 4 decades later, inspectors discovered something that should serve as a warning to the entire industry. The original 700-year-old beam was still structurally sound. The replacement, installed in 1970, had already begun to rot. The medieval wood had been prepared with immersion, slow curing and patience, The modern one had been rushed. In the far north in Norway, UNESCO preservation teams studying the stave churches found the same pattern. The foundation logs of a church built in the 12th century showed chloride and salt residues deep inside the wood. These logs had been soaked in brine before construction. More than 8 centuries later, they remain intact despite relentless ice, meltwater, and constant coastal humidity. And science continues to confirm what ancient builders seemed to know by instinct. Microscopic analysis has demonstrated that fungal hyphae, the tiny filaments that propagate decomposition, cannot penetrate the calcium tannate complexes formed in lime-treated oak. It is not a passive barrier. It is a fortress, built from the wood's own chemistry. Each case study tells the same story. Medieval wood does not just survive. It wins battles against time that modern wood loses with alarming ease. Bringing these methods back to the modern world is not a matter of nostalgia. It is a matter of practicality. For anyone working on a construction project, the first step is to prepare the immersion solution. A basic lime bath can be made by mixing hydrated lime in water, letting it settle, and using the clear solution above the sediment. For a brine immersion, non-iodized salt is dissolved until saturation. To know if leaching is working, simply observe the water. As the sugars diffuse out of the wood, the solution becomes cloudy, a sign that the sap is being extracted. Only when the cloudiness disappears between water changes is it possible to know that the main nutrients have been removed. If complete immersion is not possible, repeated washings with ash water or lime solutions are still effective, especially when followed by proper drying. To replicate medieval slow curing, the wood must be stacked in a shaded and airy location, with spaces between each piece away from the ground, allowing the wind to do the work. This can take weeks or months, and this patience is exactly what makes the method work. The goal is to combine the 3 stages, remove nutrients, create biochemical hostility, and stabilize the wood's hygroscopic response. One does not need to replicate a monastery. One needs to replicate a system. In the end, the most important lesson is not chemical, archaeological, or even biological. It is philosophical. Medieval builders believed in something that we have completely forgotten. Durability is not added afterward. It is designed from the beginning. They did not build fast. They built well. They did not depend on warranties, written on labels. They depended on wisdom passed between generations, and they trusted in the simple idea that materials treated with care, time, and understanding could outlive the very men who shaped them. This is the essence of this story, and that is why medieval beams still support roofs erected before the world resembled, even remotely, what we know today. Every cathedral attic that has survived, every preserved barn, every wooden hall that is still standing, is a silent reminder of what long-term thinking once achieved. When looking at modern building materials lined up on store shelves, glistening with marketing, promises and chemical labels, the question arises, which one do you trust more? Something that has survived 800 years, or something that comes with a 5-year warranty? History is not telling us to go back in time. It is telling us to pay attention, to learn from what has endured, and not from what is merely convenient. And if it is possible to recover even a fraction of this lost mentality, perhaps the structures we build today can finally become worthy of the centuries to come. And if this documentary awakened in you the same curiosity that moved archaeologists to excavate 700-year-old beams and scientists to analyze salt crystals in the heart of medieval woods, then there is something you can do now. Something simple. But that makes all the difference. Subscribe to this channel. Each subscription is like one of those beams that medieval builders prepared with patience, a small gesture that supports a much larger structure. Leave your comment telling us what surprised you most in this story. And if you know someone who appreciates history, science, or simply the wisdom of the past, share this video. Because knowledge, just like wood treated by medieval masters, only survives when it is passed on.